All right, thank you for bearing with us. My name is Matt Habermehl. I'm your host for today. I'm here at the Wata Phra Ajarn Facebook page, and today Phra Ajarn Maha and myself are going to be talking about consciousness. Everything comes from the mind. But first, we have a special musical guest, as is quickly becoming our tradition. I would like to introduce Werapong Rawangdi and his teacher, Natachai Kanon. And Natachai Kanon teaches at Kuchinarai School in Kalasin Province. And Werapong is studying grade 11 from Nakrai Pitaya Sun High School. And he's playing a Thai folk instrument very popular in the northeast of Thailand called a can. So I hope you enjoy this special musical performance. That was wonderful. That was Werapong Rawangdi playing the can. Kapkun Krap. Well, thank you. So consciousness, that's what we're here to talk about. Oh, and I also want to thank, Mr. Natachai Kanon as well, who is Werapong's teacher. Thank you very much. That was absolutely wonderful. So consciousness. I've studied consciousness for quite a while. I did psychology at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, and then studied my master's at University of Toronto in philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and consciousness. And actually, it was during my time at the Wilfrid Laurier University when I was studying philosophy that Phra Ajarn Maha and I met in a class on Western philosophical consciousness. I'd like to bring in Phra Ajarn now. Phra Ajarn, Sawati Krap.
My great honor to talk with you again, and wonderful music.
Wonderful music, absolutely. And I'd like to remind everybody again that we're live at the Watam Phra Asawa Hamaram Facebook page, and the link is at the bottom of the screen.
Also, good morning, my sisters and brothers from Thailand.
And good evening from anybody in this part of the world. We're in the Eastern Daylight Time right now. So we have a global conversation on consciousness happening now, which is quite appropriate because although I've studied consciousness for many years from Western tradition, including some neuroscience, definitely philosophy and psychology, consciousness is looked at very differently in the Western traditions than it is in the Eastern traditions. And so Phra Ajarn Maha and I are going to speak a little bit about those differences and compare and contrast and see if we can get a little clearer on what consciousness actually is. Does that sound okay, Ajarn?
Right, that would be excellent.
Great. So I think what we should start with is, why are Buddhists interested in consciousness?
Well, this is a good question. And Buddhism has a long traditions to study about consciousness more intensively. Now, 2,600 years ago, since the Siddhartha Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, born in India, 2,600 years ago, in comparison with Western traditions, which is I heard just recently, probably 50 to 40 years, they are very seriously about trying to understanding the consciousness and its natures.
That's right. Yeah. Now, there's in the Western tradition, questions about consciousness go all the way back to the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, and Leibniz was interested in it, and William James was interested in it, who was working in the 1800s. So there is a bit of a history in the West, but really the problem of consciousness as we now know it, you're right, hasn't really been around for more than maybe 100 years or so. So Buddhism has a little bit of a head start on the topic.
Right, and first of all, before we go to more deeper detail about issue of consciousness, I have to admit you that even in Buddhism, when you study about consciousness, is one of the most complicated issue. Not easy. You have to admit this reality. Even though sometimes we feel consciousness here, you can feel it. But when you try to make more deeper investigation, it's going to be, I think, perhaps the most complex issue for the mankind. Even a Buddhist monk, me, I finished my my final education when I was 20 years old. In that time, I take 1 year study about Buddhist psychology or Abhidhamma, which is talking about consciousness, mental factors liberations and so on. I spent 1 year to study, and in the monastic curriculums, they're focusing on memory, not too much logic or debate. And I can memory a lot about, what I study from the text. But at the end of the day, I pass exams. And then when I pass exam, I question myself. I have no idea about what I study.
Yeah, that sounds a bit familiar. I also crammed before exams a lot of the times and passed them, and then promptly forgot what what the exam was about afterwards. However, some stuff does stick, and you probably don't even realize it. So hopefully, we'll be able to have a fruitful discussion. And I should say that in the West, the reason that we're interested in consciousness today predominantly is because, as you say, it's a reality that we have to contend with. It's obviously something, it's the most immediately obvious thing is that we're conscious, but yet there's nowhere in the scientific story that the feeling of being conscious, what we call phenomenal consciousness, there's nowhere in the scientific story that fits. Even if we knew everything about physics, as long as physics was written in the laws of mathematics, which captures relations, it's impossible to see how consciousness could even arise. We wouldn't predict it. If we had a completed physics, we would predict all sorts of things. We'd predict behaviors, we'd predict brain patterns, we'd predict all sorts of stuff, but we wouldn't predict consciousness. And so that's, I think, where the mystery of consciousness comes in the West. And having this immediately obvious experience and not having anywhere for it in our, the West is very proud of the scientific strides that it's made over the past 100 years since Einstein or so, and yet we don't know where to put it. So that's definitely part of why Western people are interested in it. It's largely an intellectual curiosity, but in Buddhism, it's more than that, isn't it?
And I would like to come to the point you raised, why Buddhism is so, interesting, or dedicates the whole lifetime. For a Buddhist monk, we dedicate the whole lifetime to study consciousness. From Buddhist perspective, everything, whether happiness or suffering, come from the mind, of course. And I heard news from social medias about some kind of wealthy person, one of the most rich person in the world, just get divorced. So if you think about financial things with with wealthy people, nonsense. So from Buddhist perspectives, that's kind of problem. The problem of relationships, getting divorced, for example, is not the problem of material thing, but it's come from emotion.
Right.
And then when you talk about emotion, where emotion come from, it's come from the mind or consciousness. So now, look, in the whole world, in the West, for example, so even though we people become more wealthy, have a lot of material things, but they have a lot of complex issue in relationships. And this is the problem of emotion. So if we don't understand the whole aspect of emotion and how it works and how to tackle with destructive emotion, we get a lot of suffering. So this is why Buddhism is interested in understanding the whole aspect of consciousness, because is the main cause of human being problem.
Right.
It's the main cause of the way we live a better life.
So if you are in a world, in whatever circumstance, if you're suffering, the problem is in consciousness, in a sense.
According to Buddhist perspective,
Mm-hmm.
right? Try to make a deeper. Sometimes it look like the problem from material things, say, such as not having enough food, not having a shelter to stay, and so on. But if you make a deeper investigation, this comes from consciousness.
And it's very difficult for the layperson to face adverse circumstances and be able to monitor their consciousness, to be able to be equanimous during the worst of circumstances. Is this something that monks strive to be able to do?
I think everyone, they have some time to be with themselves. I think not only for a person like a Buddhist monk or nuns. So I think they have some time to reflect about their life in more deeper levels. I think.
And also more time for meditation, right?
Right. So when you mention about meditation, you have to remember not only try to calm your mind down, but another kind of meditation, which is called vipassana meditation or insight investigation. For this kind of meditation, you not only sit silent, but you using a logic, to make investigation in more deeper level in order to understand the reality as it is. So actually, two forms of meditation to understand the human consciousness from Buddhist perspective. One called samatha or calm abiding meditation. Another called vipassana or insight analytical. So with insight analytical, you don't need to sit. Sometimes you don't need to sit for a long time. You're just using logic.
To observe what's happening in the mind, is that right?
Right, to observe what happened in the mind, and also to tackle some kind of destructive emotion, such as anger. So when you get anger, you don't need to go to see silence, but you can using logic, like thinking about the negative effects or negative consequences of anger. So this kind of two different kind of meditation techniques, samatha, calm abiding meditation, and vipassana or analytical meditation, is has been taught in Buddhism and is different.
Interesting. So with respect to consciousness, in Western traditions, we have not necessarily a definition, but we have ways of homing in on what we mean by the word. And so I'm wondering if I could start a little bit. This is not going to be thorough by any means. It's just going to be some examples, but to sort of give a clarification on what a lot of the times philosophers, at any rate, are talking about when they speak about consciousness. And I wonder if you might be able to try the same thing. And I'm curious where we line up and where we differ on this. So in the Western traditions, there's the problem of consciousness, or what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, is focused on sort of what you might call raw experience. Some people use consciousness in different ways. In the English language, to be awake, to be attentive, is to be conscious. But you could imagine a robot, or to be aware of something. But you could imagine that we could create a robot that we could say, was aware of its environment because it could respond to the environment. You could say that it was conscious in the awake sense because it's reactive to its environment. It seems to be aware. It's moving around. It's, this kind of stuff. But yet there might be nothing it's like to be that robot. right? It could just be the same as it's like to be a rock or something like that. We kind of picture, you kind of picture blackness as opposed to having sort of internal experience. So when we talk about consciousness in philosophy, usually we're talking about that internal experience. Some people call it qualia, but that's really the qualities of your experience, like the redness of red or the way coffee tastes or something like that. But to have that experience of what it's like to, say, drink a latte or something like that, that experience, that feeling, that phenomenal experience is what we call consciousness in the most narrow sense. And I'm wondering if Buddhism has anything similar in its own definition.
In Buddhism, when you mentioned about the term of consciousness, it just means knowing things and including itself. So like like a pure water, no color. So the nature, the real nature of consciousness means is like a pure color. So it from Buddhist tradition, it's just mean knowing thing and including itself. So it's just like observer, but it's different from mental factors like anger or feeling. Sometimes for Westerner scientists, they cannot separate between feeling and consciousness. But in Buddhism, clear, feeling is mental factors. But consciousness is different from feeling. Like you put oils and water together, and then you cannot separate which one is oil, which one is water, pure water, because it's the same color. It's the same thing, some kind of feeling, which is considered to be mental factors, one of mental factors, and consciousness. And when I study about Western philosophy about the mind, and I read some book about Western psychology. When sometimes it seems to me they don't have a very clear idea about difference between emotion and consciousness.
Right.
They lump everything, every inner experiences in a single word, emotion. But just only one thing, emotion. Everything is emotion about about inner experiences. But in Buddhism, we make a distinction between consciousness is one, mental factors is another one. So we come out with the list of mental factors, 52 mental factors, which is different from consciousness. Within 52 mental factors, we classify 14 mental factors as destructive, such as ignorance, greed, anger, and so on. 14 destructive mental factor. And then we divide mental factors as what we call constructive mental factor. 25 kinds of constructive or positive mental factors, such as mindfulness, wisdom, compassion, and so on. And then between destructive and constructive, it can become both. It can become negatives, mental factors, and it can become a constructive mental factor we call changeable mental factors, such as feeling. So you can feel anger. So if you feel anger, that feeling become negative or destructive. Then you can feel compassionate. Then that feeling become a compassionate feeling. It belong to constructive mental factor. So within the 52 mental factors, I mean, according to my tradition, Theravada tradition, but in Vajrayana tradition or Tibetan tradition, they have some kind of 51. I heard something like that. So if we divide 52 of mental factors, so we have a group of positive or constructive mental factors. We have a group of the destructive mental factors, and then we have in the middle. It can become both, depending on the mental factors arising. But when you look at the Western tradition, you have only emotion. Everything is emotion, but
Well, it shows too in our rapidly devolving society that everything is emotion. Because I think you're right. I mean, even there's a bit of a split, I should say, in Western philosophy between the analytic tradition, which is very sort of linguistically based, and the continental tradition, which is more European, which phenomenology is a part of. And phenomenology is the study of the structure of consciousness. So people like Edmund Husserl was a famous phenomenologist, for example. But in the analytic tradition and sort of the North American tradition, it's difficult to know whether sometimes people are talking about consciousness as awareness, which is very similar to consciousness as knowing, versus consciousness as this phenomenal experience. But you're right that in the latter sense, in the phenomenal experience sense, emotion is kind of consciousness par excellence. You know, it is the feelings that, or the, well, there's quite, kind of three parts to emotions from the Western tradition. There's the sort of underlying physical neurochemistry and biology, right? So that the comportment of your body, the various like adrenalines and these kinds of things that happen. Then there is the feeling, and the feeling is what we would identify as consciousness. And then there is there are distinctions between feelings that aren't felt, but that are rather contextual. And so there's a broader sort of sociological component to feelings as well. But you're right that when it comes to consciousness, the feelings like pain, for example, is a perfect example of a mysterious entity in Western thought, because you could have nerve signals firing, you could have reactions, you could even have people saying ouch and all this kind of stuff, but there's no reason in the Western tradition why that should feel like anything, right? So these feelings are part of what is mysterious about consciousness in the West. And we also identify, a lot of famous philosophers have said this, that the thing that is sort of definitive or quintessential about consciousness is that it is intentional. And intentional in this sense doesn't mean doing something on purpose. Rather, it means that it focuses on something. Any conscious state is about something. So you could have consciousness of pain, or you could have consciousness of color, or you could, this kind of thing. And it's what you're conscious of, or maybe in the Buddhist tradition, it might be like the object of your knowledge, what it is you're knowing. That is the intentionality. And I'm very curious, because I have a little bit of background studying meditation with you, and so I know how you've described states like single pointedness, for example, in very deep meditation. And I'm curious if that same thing holds in Buddhism. I know that you said that it's consciousness is knowing, including knowing the self, or knowing the knower, right? So is that also true, that in Buddhism there's always something that you're conscious of?
Can you give me a more example?
So when you're going to single pointedness, for example, you still, all of your thoughts are gone from your mind. There's no sensations. There's no emotions.
Well, different kind of consciousness when you mention about the consciousness. Different levels,
Right.
different levels of consciousness. You have to keep in mind that the first levels consciousness, which is based on the sensory levels, like based on eye.
Vision, yeah.
When you see things, you have a sense of consciousness. You aware that you see. When you hear sound, when you get smelled, you have a ear consciousness, nose consciousness, and the body consciousness, physical consciousness. You feel your body. This is called consciousness based on the sensory level. But there is another levels of consciousness which is based on the mind directly. But it mean that in the case of people who go to deep state of meditation, such as the state of absorption, the awareness about their eyes, nose, ear, and physical body already dissolves. They just feel aware about their own minds or consciousness. So in that case, it means consciousness have the ability to know itself.
Right. And so in absorption, it's still in some sense directed at something, but it's directed at itself only.
Right.
Interesting. Okay.
But when I mentioned about absorption, many different levels of absorption. Some, even though your consciousness in your eye, ear, nose, and to your body already sees, but many constructive emotion exist. You will feel many constructive emotions in the state of absorption, such as the feeling of joyfulness, which is considered to be a constructive emotion, the feeling of happiness, and the sense of equanimity and single-pointedness. This is considered to be a constructive emotion, even though you no longer feel a sensation about your ear, your eye, your nose, which is mean your consciousness in your physical body, in whole physical body gone, but you still feel about the what you call constructive emotion in the state of absorption. It doesn't mean you have no emotion and on, but it's considered to be a constructive emotion. But if you reach the fourth stage of absorption, in the form stage of absorption, we have four levels. So the first level, you can control your thinking. Your thinking can be controlled. You can manage. You can think. When you want to think, you can stop thinking. When you don't want to stop thinking. The second level of absorption dominated by the sense of joyfulness. The third level dominated by the sense of genuine happiness, and the fourth level is dominated by the sense of equanimity. So in the state of absorption, you still have emotion that you be aware of. So in that case, your consciousness arising with that constructed emotions. I don't
That's
know.
it. That's interesting. I mentioned William James before, who was a 19th century psychologist and philosopher. And he was really interested in consciousness as well, but thought that, if I recall, going back a couple of years now, if I recall, that he thought that the feelings of emotions were just the feelings within your body. It was sort of interoception, so feeling on the inside. So it could be, if you're stressed out, your shoulders are up. If, you might have a stomach problem, and all of these various parts of the body's feeling together was what you felt during an emotion. But it seems to me like that can't be true if in single pointedness or absorption, you still have feelings, but you don't have sensations any longer.
You just have feeling in the feeling about your sensation already gone, but you have feeling about emotion, constructive emotion. Because as I mentioned before, for Buddhist perspective, especially Abhidhamma or psychology, consciousness is different from mental factors.
Right.
From yes. So when you go to the deep stage of meditation, which is called absorption, even though your feeling about your physical sensation gone, completely gone, but you still have a feeling about constructive emotion.
Interesting. So where does consciousness come from? In the Western tradition, consciousness is supposed to be one of two things, I think. We've left this sort of dualism of the spirit, another world that's not material. That we left that with Descartes back when we realized that there was no way for a non-material substance to interact with a material substance. So, for example, I couldn't say I'm conscious because I was conscious. That would just have to be some sort of coincidence because they couldn't interact, right? I couldn't report on my consciousness. However, nowadays, typically we think of it in two different ways. I think the first one is more naive, and that's that the brain produces consciousness, like the liver produces bile or something, or gallbladder or whatever it is that produces bile.
Yes, I think the mainstream of Western scientists take that position. Consciousness from the brain.
Yeah, and it's not at all clear how that's supposed to work. And the other possibility is that consciousness is like an emergent property. And that means, like, for example, take water. Water is made out of H2O, which are molecules, and molecules aren't wet. But when you get enough molecules of H2O together and you put your hand in it, you get wetness, right? The wetness is itself an emergent property. That's something that's not present in the molecules, but comes across at a sort of later state of emergence. The problem with that, from the Western perspective, is that the reason water is wet seems to be because it's in consciousness. So it's hard to explain consciousness itself as an emergent property because you get into this infinite loop where consciousness has to explain consciousness, et cetera, right? So that is, I think, because the Western traditions are very much materialist. That is, whatever the material foundations for reality is, whether that's quantum fields or something more basic than that, we are, everything has to come from that. And we are also reductionist. So we think that when we take something apart and see the parts of that thing, really there's nothing that exists over and above those parts, right? That you could do a thorough analysis of any phenomenon by essentially looking at its parts. That's basically reductionism. So I think that the Western perspective of consciousness is a bit of a symptom of those two pre-theoretical commitments. And I'm wondering, in Buddhism, where does consciousness come from?
Well, this, of course, I classify consciousness in two levels. already told you one from century levels. Another one is beyond century levels.
Right.
The consciousness itself. So if I think from Buddhist perspective, if you think about the consciousness which is arising from century level, like eyes, ear, nose, and so on, in this level come from the brain. Consciousness come from physical body, come from the brain or whatever you say, or eyes, ear, nose. So without eyes, ear, nose, brain, or physical body, consciousness never exists. I mean, if you think in this level. But another level, which is maybe beyond scientific proofs from Buddhist perspective, that the consciousness doesn't exist from the physical body, from the brain. It's come from another consciousness.
Ah, interesting. So this is an interesting difference between, I think, how Buddhism talks about consciousness and the West does.
Right.
And I think that this part is in the West because of Christianity. I think the sort of religious history informed the way people thought about these kinds of ideas, these concepts, because consciousness in the West is often thought to be identical with the self. So,
Right.
like, I am my consciousness.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And so the consciousness then, because it's me, it's got to be something stable, something that exists throughout time, right? But in Buddhism, that's not quite right, is it? It's more like a time step process where one moment of consciousness gives rise to the next moment of consciousness. Could you say a little bit more about how that works?
Yes. So, yeah, right. You are right. From Buddhist perspective, the consciousness come from this consciousness, because from Buddhist perspective, they don't think consciousness as something like identity or something solid, but changeable, always changing, depend upon the cause and condition. Say in this second, within this second, within 1 minute, we don't know how many consciousness arising, remain, and ceasing. We don't know, but it's always changing all the time. So this kind of the moment of this consciousness, for example, my consciousness, which is talking with you now, come from the previous consciousness, and this consciousness will generate the next one. So whatever quality of my consciousness now in this moment generates the next consciousness. If you ask question about where consciousness come from, where it's going to go, it's come from the previous moment of consciousness, and it's going to generate the next consciousness. Actually, just want to clarify you about how consciousness works in terms of Buddhism, so that you can see no sense of selves in consciousness, which is different from Western perspectives. The basically the way consciousness works is similar to factory. There is the process of the like a process, working like a process. There is I would like to divide in 3 different processes on how our consciousness works. The first I call input. The second I call process, and the third one I call output. So input, output, process. I mean, within a single moment of consciousness, the three process of their working: input, process and output. In the process of input, consciousness, start to searching. The first step, consciousness start to searching emotion. And then when the consciousness is searching emotion, and then the second step, picking up emotion, which is they say they see one consciousness in eyes, they see one particular picture, they pick up. This is the picture of their life, and they ignore another picture which is they don't like. And when after they pick up, they make investigation. That's the third step of our consciousness. They're making investigation by a picture they see. Is this beautiful picture or not beautiful picture? And then if it's beautiful picture, they go to another steps, which is called decision making. Decision making. They decide to get that picture, and this is the process of output. So it starts from searching emotion and picking up emotion and investigation, and then decision making to take that emotion, and then consciousness go to another process, which is called process. Go to another step, which is called process. In the step of processing, consciousness eating. In this case, the consciousness eating that emotion. In this case, a picture eating. And then after the consciousness eating emotion, whether emotion come from eyes, ear, nose, and then consciousness go to next process, which is I say output. In the process of output, the consciousness making a record of that information, of that picture. And then after making a record, this moment of consciousness ceasing and generates the next consciousness. So from a Buddhist perspective, if you see the whole process of how consciousness works, you cannot see any sense of self, because it starts from output process, which is searching, picking up, examining, and decision making. And then after that they go to the process of eating emotion, and then they go to the process of recording and ceasing.
And does this happen sort of instantly, or what's the time scale over which these three steps happen?
Naturally. Is it naturally?
Naturally. Is it something extended? Like, I know I can picture the process you're talking about could take a few seconds, for example, right?
I don't know how it quick, but it's happened quick within one single moment of consciousness.
Okay.
After the single moment of consciousness ceasing, and then it generates the next moment, and then come back to repeat that cycle again.
So what is the relationship then? Like I mentioned, in the West, consciousness and the self is considered to be very closely related. If people imagine that they have life after death, they imagine automatically that it's conscious life, because they can't imagine themselves being anything other than the consciousness. I don't think this was always historically the case, but especially today, the sense of self is tied so strongly to one's own consciousness in the West. And I'm wondering, in Buddhism, what is the relationship between the self and consciousness?
Well, because think in the Western world, they don't know that we can devise, in reality, we devise consciousness out from mental factors. So they feel consciousness is rigid, cannot devise. So when they feel consciousness rigid, cannot devise, they have a sense of self. But in Buddhism, because we devise mental factors out from consciousness, and then we see the process of consciousness working. So we see the consciousness working as a process, not
as like a persistent object.
right, not something never change.
Right.
It's working like a process from one moment to moment, depend upon which cause and conditions. So we cannot find the sense of self. Where is the sense of self in consciousness? If you are going to look at the sense of self in the process of searching emotion, but the process of searching emotion is not identity, because it's related with the process of what you call picking up. It generates the consciousness to picking up emotion, and then the picking up generates the process of examining. So we cannot find the identity where in the process. Like if you look at the factory, many different process. When people produce some kind of product, they have the state of input. They have the state of process or doing it. They have the output, which is you getting product. And then you try to find where in the center of factory, and then you cannot find.
Yeah.
It's the same with the idea of consciousness in Buddhism. When you divide consciousness into mental factors, and many different kind of mental factors, 52 mental factors, and then when you look at how consciousness work like a process, you cannot find the center. Where is center? But we feel that we have a center somewhere, but by deeper analysis, deeper investigation, we cannot see the center.
Yeah, that's interesting, because a lot of our sense of self must come from the perspectival nature of sensory consciousness, right? So I'm seeing, but I'm seeing from here rather than from over there. I'm hearing, but I'm hearing from here rather than from over there. And then I have feelings of like vestibular senses, interoception. So my stomach I can feel and all this kind of stuff, whereas I can't feel your stomach, right? So this sort of, I think, might be what gives rise to this identification with consciousness and selfhood, because we consider consciousness to be a unitary experience, but what they call compositional. So consciousness has parts, but if you were to separate out those parts, it would not be the same consciousness anymore, according to the Western view.
I think the problems about not only the Western people, for regular people who never practice Buddhism, because they feel they have a sense of self somewhere else, because they just react on what they see, what they hear, what they sense in the first looking, but they never go more deeper to make a deeper investigation. They believe from what they see in that moment. They believe from what they hear in that moment. But if you look it in more deeper, makes a more deeper investigation about what you see, the feeling of self disappear. If you make a more deeper investigation from what you hear, like beautiful music you hear. You go too deeper to make investigation. Where is wonderful sound come? And you try to separate, look at the whole brain, on mechanism in the brain until atom neurons, and then go to find the sound from probably like a musician we heard today. Where it's come from? Take on instrument out together, and then you cannot find where is sound. You cannot find it. You cannot find any set of cells in that level.
That's interesting. A lot of people report in deep states of consciousness actually losing the sense of self and feeling at one with everything. Is this why? Just because the deeper you go, the more you sort of shed the illusions of self?
Yes, the more you make investigation in deeper levels, the feeling about identity, disappear. But by just looking, by just hearing, you believe there is a sense of self somewhere else.
So let me ask this then. This is something that's always puzzled me, and I think I've hit you with questions similar to this in the past. But if Buddhism holds that reincarnation is true, and consciousness isn't the self, and now I say this knowing that there's a non-self interpretation of Buddhism, but what is it that gets reincarnated then? It's not the consciousness, is it?
Matt, when you mentioned about reincarnations, first of all, you have to understand that the idea of reincarnation or life after life, the Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, talk about life after life or reincarnation, but he also talk about how to remove the cycle of
samsara.
Samsara or reincarnation. So if you understand the consciousness, which is empty of intrinsic selves, whenever you understand this kind of nature, you will no longer get reincarnation. You get exit.
You get to get off the train.
Yes.
The merry-go-round.
You no longer get suffering from birth and sickness, aging, and dying. So, of course, life after life is the idea in Buddhism, but the Buddha focusing on how to get exist from the cycle of reincarnation, and how to get exist is to understanding the nature of emptiness in this consciousness. So when you understand that this consciousness in reality having no intrinsic selves at all, when you understand that, when you get understand that, you become enlightened being. You get exit from the cycle of the rebirth.
Okay, there's lots more to talk about there, but I'm going to shift slightly. I think one way to get at consciousness is also to figure out what is meant by the unconscious. And in the West, we have unconscious and subconscious. They indicate two different things, but one is like a species of the other. So the subconscious would be a type of unconsciousness. Now, in Freudian psychotherapy, the unconscious is quite powerful. It will direct a lot of your behaviors, even though you're not aware of that happening. So in some sense, it's like a little machine, in the background, doing all these calculations, doing all these associations, and you become aware of only a fraction of it, kind of as you're acting it out in some sense. Is the unconscious or subconscious, are there similar concepts in Buddhism? And if so, what are they?
Well, if you question about unconscious. It seems to me that in Buddhism, there is some kind of emotions, destructive emotion, which is normally people are not aware, but it be arising in one particular circumstances, but normally it doesn't exist. And it doesn't come up to the surface. Give you example, ignorance is considered to be one of destructive emotion, which is unconscious for normal people. What I mean about ignorance, I mean the misconception to reality.
Okay, so wrong ideas, basically.
Yes, wrong idea. And for normal people, it seems to them what they believe, what they think is right, even though it's not the case. So this is considered to be a subconscious. Subconscious. I give you example. We just talk about the sense of ID or identity or selves. By just looking something, we have a feeling of sense of ID. But when we stop for a while and we calm the mind down, and then we make investigation in more deeper level, the feeling of ID or identity disappear. So when you have the feeling of identity in the first place, you just looking thing. This is a what you call this is a considered to be what you call a destructive emotion in the level of unconscious mind.
Yeah, I think we probably would just say that those are like implicit beliefs, right? So as you have sort of experiences about how the world works, you sort of form a model, but you don't bring your awareness to that model at all. Rather, the model just sort of informs your behavior, and you might be aware of your behaviors or aware of some of the sensations that accompany it or something like that.
I think also the feeling of anger also is, according to Buddhist perspective, considered to be emotion in unconscious level of the mind, because normally anger doesn't exist in every minute.
Right.
Even though you still have the feeling of anger in somewhere else, in the deeper inside your consciousness, but you don't know where is that feeling go. Not, I mean, in normal situation, but when you confront with one particular situation, say confront with your enemy, and then that feeling come out. This is considered to be emotion in unconscious level of the mind also.
That's interesting. Yeah, we have something similar because there is occurrent, we call them occurrent emotions, which means that they're emotions that you're actually experiencing right now. And then there's more sort of tacit or background emotions. So like I could say, I'm angry at so-and-so, right? And somebody could ask me at a party, are you still angry at so-and-so? And I'd be like, yeah. But meanwhile, the whole party, I wasn't feeling angry, right? So, but where does that sort of emotional state go in the meantime? It's still there in some sense. And this is what I guess you mean by that it's unconscious at that point.
Yes, that's the I mean by unconscious. And many kind of emotion, both constructive emotion, negative emotion, some kind of emotion never exist unless you stay in one particular situation.
Like boredom?
Pardon?
Like boredom, like if you get bored of something, like you get nonplussed and sort of fatigued with something, tired of something, you can only have that emotion if you don't change the circumstance or the condition.
But I mean, many kind of emotion, both constructive emotion and destructive emotion, normally stay in subconscious mind, become unconscious. It's arise only when you meet some particular situation, but normally it doesn't exist.
Interesting. Now, so there's two more questions I have for you. The first is, sorry, go ahead. You had something more to add?
Most of the time that if you observe yourself on daily basis, most of the time the emotion which is become conscious for normal people is the feeling of equanimity or neutral feeling. So now you feel neutral, not get angry or not feel joy or not feel happiness. Most of the time, the feeling of neutrality exists to people on daily basis. This kind of emotion is conscious most of the time. But another kind, like anger, hatred, jealousy, and so on, is arising only one particular situation.
I see what you mean. So equanimity or neutrality is kind of like a baseline default state in some way. So it can occur pretty much within any context, depending upon the quality of the mind. Whereas anger or something like that needs a particular context in which to arise.
Yes. Yes.
Interesting. Okay. So my two final questions, I wanted to ask you about the relationship. We touched on this a little bit, but the relationship between consciousness and attention and the relationship between consciousness and memory. And I'll say a little bit about both of those things so you can kind of understand where my question's coming from. Even though I said earlier that, you know, we sometimes say we're conscious of something if we mean we just are aware of it or we're attending to it, right? We're focusing our attention on it. And I've said that a lot of the times, you know, in philosophy, we're actually talking about what it's like. Now, still, even though those are two distinct ideas, there seems to be no consciousness without attention from what we can see for the most part. Similarly, though, and almost more interesting, I think, is that there doesn't seem to be consciousness without memory. There seems to be something that necessary about having the last moment held in the present moment as a memory that is almost necessary for consciousness. And the reason I mention this is I mentioned Edmund Husserl, who was a German philosopher and phenomenologist, and he did an analysis of time consciousness. So what is it like in your structure of consciousness to be in a particular moment? How are you experiencing time? And he came up with this idea that you've got protension, which is sort of a prediction, right? An expectation. And then you have retention, which is like memory. And that these things knit together, that whatever just happened goes into memory, but the present moment also retains that memory as almost like an echo within itself. And those two things determine what to expect or what to protend or what to predict. So if you can imagine taking that structure away, so taking away protension, prediction, or expectation, taking away memory, taking away that retention, it almost seems like consciousness would vanish at that point. Like what's left, right? So between attention and memory, I'm kind of curious if Buddhism, has these concepts typically, and if so, how they relate to consciousness.
Well, from a Buddhist perspective, we have the concept of the five aggregations. Within the five aggregations, we have the parts of feeling, we have the parts of memory, and we have the parts of thinking, and then we have the parts of consciousness. Feeling, memory, and thinking considered to be mental factors, and which is normally consciousness and mental factors. And you mentioned about, in this case, memory. When they exist at the same time and remain in the same place, same time, and ceasing in the same time, same place. But from Abhidhamma or Buddhist psychology, if consciousness ceases, memory, feeling, and thinking will cease, we no longer stay.
What about the opposite? What if memory ceases? Does consciousness cease?
No. If memory is feeling gone and thinking gone, consciousness still exists.
Ah, right.
So even though this kind of what you call inner experiences arising at the same time, remaining in the same time, and ceasing at the same time, but in some stage, even though feeling gone, memory gone, and thinking gone, consciousness still remains there. For example, in case of the state of absorption, the fourth state of absorption, which is consciousness remains, the quality of consciousness remain, luminosity and clear light remain, but on feeling gone, memory gone, and thinking gone, just consciousness remains.
How is time experienced in those states of consciousness?
You mean
like, do you feel the passage of time
in consciousness in level of absorption? You mean?
Yes.
Well, I think the sense of time relates with the feeling, memory, and thinking. So if this kind of emotion gone, feeling gone, a memory gone, thinking gone, in that moment, the sense of time already disappear. It seems to me that when people go to the state of pure consciousness, in this case, I mean the fourth state of absorption, which is the nature, the full nature of consciousness, luminosity, and clear light dominant in that time. The sense of time, the feeling of time already gone in that state. It seems to me that the feeling of time relates to feeling, memory, and thinking. So if you no longer have a sense of feeling, memory, and thinking, you have no sense of time. In that moment.
That's interesting. And I think that it shows how valuable the contemplative traditions are for studying consciousness, because a lot of the analyses that we have in the West is analysis of regular waking consciousness. And so things like time being an inextricable part of consciousness, we might get that idea just because we never study consciousness in those deeper levels. Whenever we do it, we're always sort of self-reflecting, right? We are always thinking about consciousness. We're always trying to observe without disturbing what we're observing.
So that's why the Buddhism come out with the techniques to study consciousness, which is called samatha or calm abiding meditation, and vipassana or insight analytical. So some level of consciousness you cannot access by logic. It's beyond logic. It's beyond thinking. So in order to understand that kind of level of consciousness, you have to find a way to remove all kind of thinking. So in order to remove all kind of thinking, so the Buddha suggests the technique of samatha or calm abiding meditation. Then when you can remove by practicing calm abiding meditation on kind of thoughts, feeling, and memory, and so on, then you can reach the full nature of consciousness, which is beyond logic, beyond thinking, beyond time. So it mean the full nature of consciousness cannot be attained or reached by thinking or logic. It's beyond thinking and logic. No matter how you try to think, thinking becomes obstruction immediately to block you to understand the full nature of consciousness, which is very pure, like pure water. So in order to know the pure nature of consciousness, you have to drop on kind of thinking, feeling, memory, or whatever.
Interesting. Okay, so final question for you. I know I said I had final questions before, but I'm thinking about our audience right now, and I'm thinking that somebody might want to do some experiments for themselves to investigate their own consciousness more closely. And I wonder, could you give any advice for somebody who's just beginning this journey? What's the best way to start out that investigation?
Well, this is a good question, but hard to say.
Is it different for everybody?
Different from everyone, different from everyone, but and different from also not only personal types, also with the techniques to observe the nature of consciousness. For example, within the samatha or calm abiding meditation, we have 40 techniques to calm the mind down.
Is that stuff like focusing on the breath coming in and out of your nose? Is that one of the techniques?
And this is one of the techniques.
Okay, but there's 40.
40 meditation techniques. I mean, in my tradition alone. So it's very difficult to give a precise suggestion. So basically, I deal with each individual, because also when each individual come to talk with me, they have different experiences about meditation.
And different expectations and
yes,
different minds, right? A different mind will respond to different stimuli.
Put in that way. But if I'm going to give you a very simple solution, very simple way to see the pure nature of your consciousness is not thinking anything, not feeling anything, not memory anything.
Which is hard, which is very hard to do.
Whenever you feel something, you say, "Oh, this is not the right way to understand the nature of pure consciousness because it's become obstruction already." Whenever you feel, you think, or whatever you think about consciousness, or whatever you feel, "Oh, this is not the way, not the right way." Whenever you try to memory something, or you think this is not the right way also. So the way to see my pure state of consciousness is not thinking, not feeling anything, not memory anything. You become like a dead person, like a dying person, a dead person, no feeling. Like you become like a robot, maybe a robot.
Interesting. But a conscious one.
Right.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I found that whenever I tried to quiet my mind, I would have some success, but then my mind would go, "Oh, yay, you had some success," and then everything would just be ruined, right? I'd have to start over again.
If you still have the feeling you are success or not success or whatever, is that feeling block?
That's wrong. Yeah.
It's block yourself to go to more deeper state of consciousness or more pure state of consciousness. So, because as I mentioned before, the pure state of consciousness, right, the state of luminosity or clear light, will exist whenever your thinking disappear, your feeling disappear, and your memory gone.
Yeah. So how would you know that if you had other things going on in your mind, right?
Right.
I find that one effective way, and you can sort of correct me on this, is through mindfulness. Because if you get used to watching your thoughts and your emotional responses, it gets a little bit easier to let them go once they come up. And if you can do that repeatedly and often enough, you get the habit or the skill to be able to let the thoughts go almost before they even enter your mind. It's almost like you could feel them forming, but you let them go before they actually bubble up to awareness. Does that sound about right?
One way to expel the thinking out from your mind, and you say, right, to be aware your physical moving. When you talk, you feel aware you are talking. When you move your finger, you just feel aware you move your finger. So you don't put any idea when you move your finger. You don't put any feeling when you move your finger. You just do. You just have a bare awareness when you move your any part of your physical body, bare awareness, not put any feeling, "I'm going to move this," or
yeah, it's like, I am going to, unless your hand is damaged or something, it happens automatically rather than thinking about it, right?
Right. But the problem is for most people, because they used to think, they used to feel. So when they want to move a finger, for example, they think, "Oh, I'm going to move my finger," but that's block you to calm the mind, because you think you are going to move. But if you don't think, you just have bare awareness, you just move with awareness. And then that's kind of mental mechanism, clear thinking, clear feeling, and then make your mind become more open, become more clear. So this is the one way to deal with the monkey mind, thinking and feeling, is mindfulness in physical body, whatever you do in your daily life.
Right.
You walk, you smile, you whatever, you just do with bare awareness. You don't do with you thinking to do or feeling to do. But it's very difficult to it's very difficult to do, because you used to think, you used to feel.
I feel like some athletes who get into something they call a flow state, right? Like if you're running down a field or something and you are just, your body is just doing it. You don't have to think about every footstep. You don't have to think about every muscle movement. It's sort of an automatic thing. So I find that in extreme athletics sometimes, or if you're just lifting a weight that, is challenging for you, it is actually a little bit easier to get rid of your thoughts and just be sort of present in that moment. However, I do find still that the physical feelings themselves still come to consciousness.
Right.
Yeah. So but that would just be a starting point to understand how that works.
Right.
Interesting. Well, John, thank you so very much. We're at about an hour and a half now, so I think it might be time to close it down. Is there anything that you'd like to mention to our audience before we end?
This will be the last time of our talk this year, because after this I will take a long solitude until the end of the years. If I would not die before, we'll see you again.
Well, I sincerely hope you do not die before I see you again. And same here. I am not going out into the wilderness of Thailand to meditate in caves, so I might have a slightly safer future ahead of me. But Ajarn, be safe. Thank you so very much. Khop Khun Krap.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful to talk to you. And do let me know when you get back from your sojourn.
Right. You already off from life?
Nope, but I am now.